Anyway, folks, welcome to another edition of Egberto Off the Record. Today, we're honored once again to have a conversation with decolonizing journalism's own Arturo Dominguez. Arturo, thank you so kindly for being a part of this discussion. How you doing today, my friend?
Oh man, good, good. I'm glad to be on the show. It's been a little while, but we used to do these all the time. This is fun.
Yes, I know. We
Looking
got to
forward to
start.
it.
We got to start back because I mean, what's interesting is now more than ever, it is something that we need to do with what's going on with Trump and his great immigration policies and
Yeah.
his great war policies in the Caribbean and Latin America, sort of like revisiting colonialism all over again, right?
Right. That's essentially, what they're doing, like with Latin America, for example, it's about dominion. They want control, they want power, they want ownership. So yeah, there's a big Christian nationalist slant to this. There's a lot to it, really. And it goes without saying that the Trump family stands to benefit from all of it. If, for example, if we invade Venezuela and try to take their resources and their oil and stuff, I have no doubt that they'll benefit from it. But a recent article in Politico suggested that the White House reached out to several oil companies and Halliburton and things like that to see if they wanted to restart operations in Venezuela. And most of them were either, hesitant or just flat out said no. And the main reason for it is because they don't think that overthrowing the government's going to hold. They think Venezuela is going to go back to being what Venezuela is. I mean, they nationalized their resources in like 1976.
Mm-hmm. Carlos Andres
So
Perez, right?
right, right. So and a lot of people don't know that. They think it was all Hugo Chavez and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. And there's a lot of things about Venezuela that people don't understand, and in Latin America in general. There was the recent meddling by the United States and Honduras and Chile's elections. They went pretty far, especially in Honduras. They had a subcommittee meeting in the House that was broadcast into Honduras, and basically, talking down about the two candidates and only promoting the far right candidate that won. And while they're saying, we're not telling you who to vote for, they're villainizing, the two candidates they don't like. The shining moment in that hearing, honestly, was Joaquin Castro, because one of the people in that hearing was part of USAID when they overthrew the government in Bolivia in 2019 when Trump was still in office. And that's when, remember when Elon Musk said we can coup whoever we want?
Yeah.
That was that election. And the guy was in that hearing, and Castro pointed out that he was a registered foreign agent for like 7 different countries. He owns a bunch of huge corporations related to banking and stuff that all have business interests in Honduras. So like he called them out, and he pointed out, the duplicity, the hypocrisy of trying to advocate for one candidate in that hearing when he has so many business interests in that country. It
Joaquin
was
Castro did that from
Yeah,
our.
yeah.
Wow.
He used this whole 5 minutes to just roast this guy about all his stuff. And I love that it was broadcast into Honduras because they got to see both sides of this whole thing. And props to Castro for doing that.
You know what is funny? I mean, we like to think that, well, it's Donald Trump that is the one that's trying to mess with Venezuela, and somehow people would think, though in fact, many on the left would sit down and think that this is the left, or rather, this is the thing of Donald Trump, etc. A few years ago, I think it was 2019. I spoke to the ambassador of Colombia. His name is Francisco Santos.
Mm,
And at that time, they, I mean, they've been trying to mess with Venezuelan government. Beyond that, I mean, they formed a group called Grupo de Lima. I don't know if you ever
mhm.
heard of it.
Yes.
It was a group whose intent was to make it seem like an overthrow of the Venezuelan government was going to be a Latin American thing. So they got countries like I think Peru and others involved to form this sticky committee that somehow was going to overthrow this government under the auspices of, well, it is a Latin American thing. Guess
Right.
who was the lead to that organization from the United States?
Marco Rubio.
Abrams.
Oh,
Abrams.
Alia Abrams. Okay. That makes sense.
I
That makes
asked the ambassador, what's your thought about that? And he said, we can't speak about that on the record.
yeah,
Now,
I'm not surprised.
now you can see the type of involvement that we constantly have. And then when things go awry, we sit down and wonder why we have the immigration crisis with people coming over from places that we destabilize and come all the way back here. So what are your thoughts?
Well, that's another part of Latin America that a lot of people don't understand too is, the migration events that occur in Latin America are usually because of the United States, right? Whether it's meddling in an election where, a Javier Milei is going to, slash and burn the government, take away social services, and you're putting poor people on the streets, and, people are going to migrate, whether it's to the neighboring country or whether it's all the way here. Chances are they're going to stay in Latin America. Most do, but there's a direct connection there between immigration and a lot of the things that we do in Latin America. So, you know, when Hugo Chavez took over in Venezuela, I say took over, he won he was duly
Hmm.
elected, um, by a large margin. There was some migration out of Venezuela, but in 10 years after Chavez, maybe a million and a half left Venezuela. Maduro takes power after Chavez dies, whatever, and then Trump comes in office, puts these, just strict sanctions on Cuba and Venezuela. And it's not a coincidence that the mass migration ballooned from 1.5 million to 4 million in a couple of years to, to the 7 million, 8 million that left Venezuela, and the 500,000 or so or million that left Cuba. Those are directly tied to US sanctions. And, when you cripple a country like that, like for example, Venezuela was undergoing a lot of economic turmoil because the price of oil tanked, right? And they weren't getting the revenue that they had. Well, the Trump administration took advantage of that opportunity and really put the screws to Venezuela, made food hard to get, made medicine and medical equipment hard to get. These are all the same problems you see in Cuba right now. And, they're dealing with their own little epidemic of like mosquito borne illnesses that are, ravaging the country, and they don't have access to open markets to get medical equipment and fuel and things like that. So, that's what happened to Venezuela. And next thing you know, within 2 years, I mean, I'm telling 2 years, it went from 1.5 million to 4 million left Venezuela. And, they say about 18% came to the US and the rest stayed in Latin America. Colombia took in the most,
Hmm.
uh, at close to 2 million. Um, and it's interesting because, supposedly Colombia is a third world country, and, they have universal health care, and you didn't hear them crying about Venezuelan migrants. A lot of people in Colombia are upset about it. Everybody has their issues with it. It's always going to be that way. But you didn't see this nationalist type of, we're going to go after immigrants. We're going to start throwing them in camps. We're going to start dumping them on the other side of the border. Like, you didn't see that kind of stuff. You don't see that anywhere. You're about to see it in Chile, where the son of a Nazi just won the presidential race there, and he ran on a lot of the same language Donald Trump did. He went after Venezuelan migrants, you know, blamed crime on immigration. He blamed all the country's problems on immigration, and he unfortunately he won. And there's meddling in that election, as I said, that Trump admitted to publicly. In an interview while he was on the tarmac somewhere, he mentioned both countries, and it's just astounding to me that like more people haven't seen it before. And in a way, I'm kind of thankful that the White House is so incompetent, because they're just putting it all right out there about meddling in elections, about lying about Maduro. Like, if he was so bad, right, and you can't justify going in there, they have invented I don't know how many narratives about him in just 1 year.
And people
from
believe it, right? In other words, we're there for the drugs. Of
yeah.
course, because they're there for drugs, the price of cocaine has fallen because more drugs are actually coming into the United States. It's amazing that people buy this crap. Now, let me tell you where I want to kind of take the conversation.
Okay.
For the longest time, we started to see what I call a revert to the norm. In other words, Latin American countries sort of moving to the left, and America didn't done quite like that. I mean, we now see what's happening in Argentina. Argentina is going to the crapper, even as we are trying to hold them up by hurting our own farmers, giving the soybean market pretty much to Argentina, giving them bailouts with our monies. We see what's happening in Bolivia. You wrote an article on Bolivia recently. Bolivia was under what's his name? Can't remember the former president of Bolivia.
Louis
Uh,
Arce
no,
was it?
Bolivia. Um, the indigenous
Morales, Evo
Morales.
Morales.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Evo Morales. You know, they had things like subsidies for oil, etc. Now, in a shock manner, this government comes in and start to rail things around. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So the what's his name? Paz is the new president there. He took over last month, and he's more so in Latin America he's considered right wing. But in the United States, he's basically a Bill Clinton Democrat.
Right,
So there's a word for that. It's called neoliberalism,
right.
where they're basically the same. So yeah, he came in immediately and he ran on this. He ran on ending fuel subsidies across the country, but he promised that he would be implementing policies to help the population sustain eliminating fuel subsidies. About the only thing that he really did was raised minimum wage about 20%, and minimum wage there is really low.
Hmm.
And most economists are like that's not enough. And in under a month or in a little over a month, he ended the fuel subsidies, and immediately fuel prices skyrocketed. 180% for like diesel fuel. And Bolivia has been in a situation where a lot of their export, you know, petroleum type exports have been dwindling, going down since 2014. And those exports is how they bring in US dollars, right? Most people don't understand you need to have US dollars to buy oil and fuel from other countries. They call it the petrodollar.
Hmm.
And so Bolivia has been importing like 60% of its diesel and like half of its gasoline. And, there's a lot of issues with the subsidy program. And I get that a lot of things needed to be done to it, but there was a lot of reforms that were suggested to fix the problem instead of just eliminating it outright and kind of transition away from subsidies. But since he did it so quick, now there's questions about being able to get food to people because of the cost of fuel. There's uh, highways are blocked right now. There's protests everywhere. And, Morales tried to do something similar in 2010, and it blew up in his face in the same way because he didn't have policies in place, and he immediately put the subsidies back. And since then, it's been a struggle to figure out what they should do with them. But he calls it, shock therapy for the economy. I call it a shock economy. And that's, he promised to try to keep some of the social programs in place, for school children and for the elderly and stuff. But, overall, he wants to cut spending 30%, which means shutting down a lot of government stuff like Javier Milei did. And that's the part that's scary for Bolivia. And, when you destabilize economies like this, it makes it easier for the US to get involved in your business, for one.
What I don't understand with these governments, including our own, is why they believe cutting social programs really have a positive economic effect. A dollar doesn't know from where it is spent. Whether the dollar is spent by the government taxes, which usually tax the more affluent people, or it comes from some other domain, a dollar doesn't know from where it is spent. I think it is one of the most important things I think we have to start teaching the population at large. And that's not just the population in Latin America, but the population here, is that social programs recirculate money faster than enriching the few, which God knows that that money is going to be circulated back in the economy. And the only thing that determines economic activity is the speed of which dollars and money circulate. I mean, the myth that social programs are the problem of an economy is just that, a myth.
Right. Yeah, and when you look at countries like Argentina, where there's something like 5 million people don't have direct access to electricity or sewage or city water, running water. When fuel prices increase like that, and this is the same in Bolivia too, because Bolivia is a most by and large an indigenous country made up of dozens of tribes, and a lot of agriculture and stuff. And when people have to spend more money on fuel, they're spending less money in the economy. They're spending less money on groceries. When you have these social programs, like for example, universal health care, right? If
Mhm.
people don't have to pay a hospital bill, they're putting that money into the economy. And
Exactly.
that's what works for Latin America. Like, you see Bernie Sanders always compare us to other European nations, and I get what he's trying to do, the economically developed countries, right? Quote
Mhm.
unquote. But if Latin American countries are so poor and they're so third world, why is it they can afford some type of universal health care for them, but the richest country in the world refuses to do it for us? It just doesn't make any sense. And when you try to, they call these electoral coups, like in Honduras, to throw a far right candidate in there that's going to do this whole slash and burn and take all these social services away. It's so these corporations can privatize all those things and profit off of them. And people don't understand that. For example, I seen a Trumper guy on social media, and he's celebrating the fact that so many federal employees no longer have a job, like hundreds of thousands of them. And his argument was, I'd rather have a private business that makes a profit than having a government that loses money. And I'm like, dude, governments aren't supposed to make money, for one.
Right.
And two, how can you support building something, right? Say, for example, your water infrastructure or your electrical grid, right? Taxpayers footed the bill for that. Then you give it to a private company. Now that private company is charging you to use the thing you just paid to build. Like, you wouldn't do that in any other circumstance. Like, if you hired somebody, if you did some work around your house, you're not just going to give it to somebody and then they're going to charge you to walk through your gate to in and out of your backyard. It doesn't make sense, right? And some people will say that what I'm talking about is socialism, and it kind of is. But when it comes to, infrastructure that we built, electric, water, things that are necessities, right? We should be paying the maintenance for that and not putting money in somebody's pocket. We paid to build it. When CenterPoint Energy, right, private company who profits off of us here in Houston, wants to upgrade their grid, what do? They tax our bill, and we have to pay that bill to upgrade the grid. So we're paying to rebuild the grid, and we're also paying to access it while some group of people is getting rich on the side. It just doesn't make sense. And
On my program, I call what these corporations do as parasitic. And I
of
got
course,
hell from some people for calling it parasitic. And that is indoctrination that I talk about. You just mentioned something that's very important. There is a town here, many towns here in Texas. And you being here in Houston should have seen this on the Channel 13 News and some others, where before these people even pay their water bill, they're paying $140 in state, even though water is regulated in Texas, that these water companies are regulated in Texas, they were allowed to charge every household 30 something dollars before any metered water is charged. What that means, Arturo, is it's just free money. They're claiming to rebuild, to build their infrastructure or whatever. I am saying these are things that shouldn't be led to for private companies. Electricity,
right,
water. There's nothing that the indoctrination that we go through, the fallacy that we go through, is that somehow a private sector company that is dependent on a profit is somehow going to be more efficient than the government. The government has to be. I did some calculations in healthcare. The government would have to be over 30% inefficient for it to make sense to privatize healthcare. by assuming that somehow the private sector is more efficient. In other words, Social Security has an overhead of 3%. The nominal overhead for private insurance is 18%. The actual overhead closer to 30%. It is a fallacy to believe that somehow the private sector for delivering services, for healthcare, for delivering services, for utilities can be less expensive. You drive in Houston, you're driving on freeways that are, I mean, freeways we support all along, and we're paying a fee to use the freeways. It makes no
Right.
sense.
Right. No, it really doesn't. And like, when you look at how, the whole healthcare deal in Latin America, right? It's not really a leftist idea either,
Right.
because you look at far right countries like Argentina, Paraguay, El Salvador with Bukele,
England.
you know, they all have healthcare. They all
Yes.
have healthcare, and it's about putting people first. And I hate to use the word populism, but that's what that is. And that's what wins elections basically everywhere. When Bernie Sanders says that, you know, all these countries, and he mentions the European countries, medical bankruptcy doesn't exist. What he's leaving out is medical bankruptcy doesn't exist anywhere else in the world.
But
It's
here.
not just economically developed European countries. People aren't dying from medical bankruptcy in Latin America. And, they're supposed this is what blows me away about the whole third world argument. How are they third world, right? And here we are. Somebody the other day, they see the Cuban flag in my profile and they're like, "Oh, how's the electricity in Cuba?" I'm like, "Bro, I live in Texas and it sucks." Like,
Yeah.
it,
Right.
we have Cuba problems in Texas. Okay, so
We
let's
have
talk about that.
blackouts every time the thunder. If you hear a thunder, prepare yourself. The electricities are
Yeah.
going to be going.
We
I
had a
look.
we had that mild freeze the other day, and our power was out twice the next day, and I'm like, it was in
Right.
the 40s. I'm like, "Dude." What? Yeah.
It, it makes no sense. And I think one of the things that we have to do, Arturo, and why it's so important. There's an article that you wrote on Bolivia that I hadn't read yet. That I had in my list of things to read. And the reason why I'm saying this is we have to find a way to present all of this in a manner that people are willing and wanting to read, right? Because they believe everything they hear on mainstream media, which is a neoliberal argument most of the times. And we have to point out that the reality, look, Brazil, the kids go to college for free.
Yeah.
Germany, it's no different than Brazil as far as of the kids going to school. It's amazing that we allow ourselves this. But I tell you what I proposed or thought about, Arturo, why it is that they needed Venezuela to fail, they needed Cuba to fail, they wanted Argentina. What's the woman who governed Argentina for a while? They needed to ensure that she failed
Yeah.
because if people ever realize that a government that says the resources of the land belongs to all of us, and as such, the profits from said resources belong to the people, and as such, the people could get free health care, not really free, that our society pays for, and could get all these things at a reasonable price. It scares them because the wealth, the obscene wealth extracted from all of us in this country, they would see that other countries that we call third world countries are doing much better with it. Your thoughts?
Yeah, again, that's the quandary, right? We're so programmed in the United States to think that all these other countries are, failures or underdeveloped or whatever, when the reality is they're overexploited. And even so, they can still provide what this country fails to provide or refuses to provide. I mean, there's, food for impoverished people, there's free healthcare, there's, a lot of electrical subsidies, fuel subsidies. There's a lot of things. Just did an interview a couple of days ago with a woman in Venezuela. She's an educator there, a college professor, and she tells us about all these programs, and we've already known about most of them, but she explains how they work. And it's just it's interesting to see how a country that's supposed to be so bad off is doing so well compared to what we're being told. You know, you talk to people in Venezuela and they're going about their daily lives, right? There's
Mhm.
college students are like, we still have finals. Like, I don't know what this war shit is about, but we still have finals. We still have to do this. We still have to do that. And, I laugh at it a little bit because, a lot of them in Venezuela are like, who are all these people who are suddenly concerned with what the hell we're doing in Venezuela? And that's the issue, right? Like, we're not supposed to be involved in other countries' internal business. That's a literal violation of international law. And, the invasion of Panama, the Grenada, all of those were violations of international law because we, went after a country's sovereignty. And that's what we're trying to do now. And like, you destabilize these countries, you create mass migration events, economic calamity. And like, if you think that what happens in Latin America doesn't affect us in the United States, you're sorely mistaken. Just look at the amount of drugs we buy from Latin America. Everything that happens in Latin America affects us. And, if they were to open the door, like, I don't know why the Trump administration has granted Chevron license to work in Venezuela and transport oil in and out of the country, but not anyone else. I don't understand that logic.
Oh,
Um,
payoff. Come on.
right. Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, it just doesn't. But if the idea that anybody needs to get a license from the United States to do work in Venezuela I mean, that's a colonialist thing from the get
Yes.
go. But But yeah, to just grant the one company is kind of weird. It doesn't make sense. And if you really wanted to bring fuel prices down, you'd open the floodgates, right? But the U.S. isn't interested in that. Oil
But
companies
you,
aren't
you know what
interested.
is interesting is, remember, our form of capitalism, well, capitalism in general, I am a free enterpriser to tell you the truth. But here's the
Right.
thing. They have to have manufactured scarcity.
Of
You have
course.
to have manufactured scarcity for them to be able to rip us off. Here's the deal. Remember during the pandemic, what right after the pandemic, what happened to the price of oil? At first, they were paying people to take oil because there was oil still pumping and people weren't using oil. And as soon as the pandemic started to ease, the price of oil zoomed up. Guess what, Arturo? We never had a shortage of oil.
Right.
We never had a shortage of oil. This tells you that all of this has always been manufactured scarcity. And we've used all kinds of machination from issues in Latin America, issues in the Middle East. Here's the interesting thing. Right now we're using drugs as an excuse. If you think you have a drug problem where these people supposedly believe in supply and demand. If you have a drug problem, isn't it, and you believe in efficiency, isn't it cheaper to handle the drug problem at the source than bombing another country, destabilizing another country that eventually going to send all the destabilized people up the chain back to you that you're going to have to take care of, and the drug problem still remains? Why don't you make your population happier so that they don't depend on drugs?
Right.
Either
Yeah. The source is addiction. Right? Like, we
yes,
have a major addiction problem in this country. And we really need to look at ourselves because, alcohol and drugs and things like that are used as coping mechanisms, right?
yes.
If people are, one of the reasons why drug use among the homeless population is so high is because it's a coping mechanism, right? That's how they get through a day. And the longer you have a society where people have to cope with their daily lives is where the problem lies, right? So, you have to address these things at the root causes. Just like if you want to address immigration, you really have to be paying attention to what's happening in Latin America and other parts of the world. But yeah, you can't, wherever there's a demand, there will always be supply when it comes to drugs. We've learned this through 40 years, 50 years of the war on drugs, right?
You remember that?
Um, right. And like, the US military has been since like the early 2000s in 8 different bases in Colombia. And the idea is to help with surveillance stuff and narco trafficking and combating all that stuff. Meanwhile, in that time, cocaine production and distribution out of Colombia has tripled.
Right.
And, it's hard to ignore when you see that the military's presence and cocaine distribution just gets bigger. It's hard to ignore, the CIA's involvement in all these different drug smuggling events through our history, from shipping heroin to our soldiers in Vietnam to the crack cocaine epidemic. And you know what I mean? Like the
Well, they
CIA and the
even
US
got
military.
caught. The CIA sending drugs, I think, into some California city, being
Yeah,
response. I mean, there is so much of that so much of that going on. So I mean, what I see is a fraud, and what's happening in Latin America with Venezuela is a fraud. The involvement that they just about admit in that they've had in Argentina, in Venezuela, and other places. Didn't you say that Trump copped to Bolivia as well? Having some influence in Bolivia,
it was Honduras and
Honduras,
Chile. Yeah.
Honduras and Chile. Yeah, I'm talking about Chile. It's interesting because we are sitting back here talking about water sometimes in Texas, when in Chile they tried to nationalize water.
Mhm.
You know, uh, the constancy of this type of neoliberal set of policies that really try to take off all of our natural resources, put it through the private corporations, and have all of us subsidize the private companies. When I talk about these guys being parasites, it's all on constantly finding a way to extract money on people for things that should otherwise they shouldn't otherwise have any control over, right?
Yeah, I mean, especially when you're talking about infrastructure and stuff, like things that we built with our tax dollars, there's no reason anybody should be profiting off of that at all. I mean, that's not to say people shouldn't work there and earn a salary, right? But there shouldn't be a board of some corporation somewhere making money off of our water like Nestle does. Or buying water for free and selling it back to us because it's in a 2 cent plastic bottle. It's just crazy to me that we are just so brainwashed into seeing or into just falling for and agreeing to pay extra for nothing. Whenever you privatize something like healthcare, you get
Hmm.
less service, less quality, and you have to pay more money.
It makes no sense. I mean, you mentioned it comes back to what you mentioned before, and it's about that guy that said, "Oh, I rather the private sector take care of it than those government workers." It is amazing. Again, it's amazing that and that mentality isn't by accident. Okay, that mentality
Yeah.
came about by by our mainstream media pushing the false messages of the corporations. Oh, the reason why drug prices are high is because drug companies have to recover their investment. Turns out most of their investment comes from the NIH, private, charities, etc. There's a drug called Zolgensma. I was looking it up as you were speaking. uh, Arturo, the price of that drug is $2.1 million per
Holy
dose.
cow. Per
Okay,
dose?
listen,
Wow.
listen. So I covered it a couple of days ago on one of my shows on KPFT. $2.1 million per dose is for some sort of a muscular dystrophy type drugs, and once you take that drug, supposedly you stop the disease from progressing. Okay, but it doesn't reverse it; it stops it from progressing. I did some research as I was preparing for that show and found out that most of the investment to bring that drug to viability came from the NIH, came from charities, charities that take care of muscular dystrophy or one of whatever the
Mhm.
disease was that it took care of. And when it was time to capitalize on it, in other words, make a profit on it, it was turned over to a private company who decided that, well, because there aren't a huge amount of people that are gonna take this drug and we want to make a huge
Right.
profit,
Yeah.
it turns out that the price we need to charge is $2.1 million per drug. And here's the funny part. It isn't the most expensive drug out there. There's another one called Elividis for as a gene therapy, $3.2 million per single infusion. There's another one called Lenmeldi, $4.2 million per per dose. Arturo,
Wow.
all of this, all of this, we started out talking about Latin America and how the United States is trying to stop the progress of, collectivism, if you will. All of this ties together. All
Hmm.
of this is tied in together because
It is.
it's all about constantly finding ways to skim from all of us.
Yeah, and that the one thing that ties everything together from invading Venezuela to the high price of these drugs are the corporations, right? And
Mhm.
essentially everything the U.S. does is on behalf of U.S. corporate interests. When you hear Maria Corina Machado talking about privatizing everything in Venezuela, that's who she's talking to. She's talking to the oil companies, to the data companies. When you hear uh Southern Command, the U.S. military talk about how there's so much fresh water in Latin America.
Right.
That should raise red flags. They're like 30% of the world's fresh water is there. I'm like, wait, what? Why are you?
Why are you
What's
talking
water?
about that? Yeah.
Right? Why are you talking about water? And that automatically raises suspicion. So it's just crazy to me because we pay as taxpayers, we pay to produce a lot of the drugs that they're advertised to us on TV, and we're being charged exorbitant prices to buy them. I shouldn't say produce, but to create these drugs. The manufacture process. If you want to give that to a private industry or company, fine. But why am I paying hundreds of dollars for prescriptions that we taxpayers paid to create? And it's the same thing like you mentioned with toll roads, with all of our infrastructure like that, taxing us on top of taxing us on top of taxing us for the same thing over and over again. And you look at everybody talks about how cheap housing is in Texas, for example. And they always talk about, oh, the cost of living is cheaper here. And it's not. Because, for example, if you're running a business, right, they're going to charge you for, like, if I had a home based business, they try to charge me for stuff in my house. You know what I mean? Like inventory, and then the state wants a piece, the county wants a piece, the federal government wants a piece of the same thing over and over and over again. And it's just like, it's redundant and ridiculous that you have to pay so much. And when you look at where that money goes, inevitably it goes into some corporatist pocket, some money market guy, some hedge fund somewhere, and it's just ridiculous because people are getting rich for literally nothing.
For
They're
doing
getting rich
nothing. Yeah,
for
what does the
doing
hedge
nothing,
fund
right?
guy, everything that hedge fund guys and stockbrokers depend on are based on the labor, production, and intellect of somebody else. It's amazing, right?
Right.
And we are made to believe that in our type of economic system, these are the guys that have earned the right to be as wealthy as they are. Bill Gates couldn't look. I know people like to love on some of the more left leaning, even though he's not turning to be as left as I thought. Of
Right.
the more left leaning billionaire. No, 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 no. These guys are all parasites. They don't, I went to school the same place that Dell went. Dell was a little bit after me, right? And I used to build computers, and I I used to go to PCs Limited. It was a little shop on Westheimer, I mean, not on West, on Lamar Boulevard in Austin. And I would drive up from Houston to PCs Limited to buy these parts from Dell. And I remember Dell in his white t-shirt and Michael Dell, I'm talking about just a little,
Yeah.
little crazy guy that you buy stuff from. When I found out that Dell was the guy that the capitalists decided to invest in to make that computer company, was like, wait a minute. I guess he was chosen, right? People
Yeah.
have a tendency to believe, computer parts even back then, Attitudo, were all modular. In other words,
Yeah.
the inventions occurred elsewhere. It was all modular. You put it together and you build a computer. To some extent, it is still that way, right? There's no lot of innovation going into the PC or the laptop and all that kind of stuff, right? So I remember when that occurred, and so this guy becomes a multi-billionaire now, and he decides that he's going to He's going to give $1,000 or so to every body born in some year or whatever. And I had callers calling into the show and saying how great that was. And I'm like, how great that was, or what is the tax advantage he's going to get out of doing that?
Right.
Because,
Right.
if you put $1,000 into somebody's account today, it's only worth like $3,000 when they're 18 years old. Do you think that what education costs now and what it's going to cost 18 years from now? Do you think that $3,000 is going to make a difference? Hell no. But you know what? It's going to make a difference for his stock appreciation that he can sell without paying taxes on. I mean,
Yeah. It's crazy because the other aspect of this too is like a guy like Bill Gates, and they hide their money in these foundations, right? So
yeah,
the Gates Foundation, and they can avoid paying taxes, right? They create a trust, and this foundation will pass down from generation to generation to generation, and that it's essentially it's a nonprofit, right? So that money gets held there, and that's where they hide money. They'll, oh, I'm going to give this many billions to that, yeah, because that's another write off,
and the other
um,
thing, Arturo, is who gave them the right to parasitically take money from us, because that's what it is, and then decide what are the best things to do with that money, as opposed to democratically elected people deciding we are going to tax this to do this kind of work with it. Because again, remember, these companies do not create anything. These
right,
corporations do, and Americans have a hard time understanding this because the mainstream media has been so good in glorifying these guys, the stockbroker, whatever proper. I mean, these guys. We have to understand they are dependent on what we call in economic terms the excess labor of everybody else. So if you're working at a company, they don't pay you all that's what you're worth, and all the parts of what you're worth that they don't pay you is their profit.
yeah, yeah. You asked the question, who gave them permission? Our current economy is the same economy that was built on slavery. And I
Right.
know some listeners might balk at this, but at the end of the day, the money derived from slavery is what created the stock market. It's what built the railroads. It's every major thing this country ever did was done with wealth generated from slavery. That same type of ownership system is what exists today.
Yes.
When people say that you're a wage slave, it's because they haven't quite made that connection all the way back to 1619. I know
Mhm.
y'all hate that book, but it's a must read. Because the basis of that is that's where this economy was born. At 1619, this economy was born, and it was born through slavery. And when we quote unquote abolished slavery, we didn't really. All we added was a qualifier, right? The 13th Amendment says basically, if you want to enslave them, convict them first.
Right.
And that's why we have the mass incarceration system that we have. And it's really not hard to make these connections, even if you're looking at it on a surface level or in a general sense, because you go from slavery to Jim Crow to redlining to, everything leading up to the Civil Rights Act. And then the Civil Rights Act happens, and then it's nothing but backlash to the Civil Rights Act. Meanwhile, the economy stays the same and all
Mhm.
the other social systems stay the same.
Let me up you one, Arturo, because right now you, in effect, you have talked about the slaves, and most of the slaves you're talking about, let's say, black folks, and to some extent, indigenous, and to some extent with the railroad, the Chinese. But I
Right,
want to take it a step further, because this is where the symbiotic relationship should have already been established.
right.
Those were the those were the slaves that could easily be identified.
Yeah,
But what we have today is also a new kind of slavery. It's a more efficient slavery. And a lot of people get upset when I say it this way. What we have now is antiseptic slavery. And who are those antiseptic slaves? Anybody that has a home, a car, look in the mirror, you're an antiseptic slave. And let me explain in how many different ways we are antiseptic slaves, right? You go to work every day and you're told what to do. You're told about insurance companies. They like to tell you that you have a choice with insurance companies for your health care, but do you really have a choice of who you want to enslave you or tell you what doctor you can see, what medicine you can
Right.
get? All these things. That's a form of slavery. And let me explain why it is actually more devious than chattel slavery, than racial slavery, than all the other types of slaveries. You see, when the master owned people who had my hue, the master considered me property. Because I was property, and in a capitalist society, the most important thing is property, capital. He had to make sure that this property didn't go bust. So he had
Right.
to feed me, he had to clothe me, and he had to give me health insurance. Not health insurance, but make sure I still was healthy. That
Healthy
was
enough to
a
work.
cost. That was a cost to doing business.
Yeah.
Keeping the slave alive was a cost of doing business. You know, the antiseptic slave, all of you that can look in the mirror right now, guess what? You don't have to. Guess what? Your employer no longer has to worry about. He doesn't have to clothe you. He doesn't have to feed you. He doesn't have to give you anything because now they found a way to make you disposable. You can't work? Bye bye. Next, come on up.
Right.
When one was property, he did everything to hold on to that property, to keep that property functioning. You are still property today. Everybody is still property today, but you're now disposable. And
Yeah.
it is sad to think about it that way. And some people feel, they feel a little bit, oh, should I really be thinking about things this way? And my answer to you is yes. You know why? Because that is exactly how it is. Your thoughts?
No, no, I'm with you 100% there. You know, employers keep you employed through various very devious means. You know,
Right,
you lose your job, you could lose your insurance. You know, there's a lot of things that hang over your head, paying you the least amount of money possible. You know, that comes from the slave era. Okay, now we have to pay them. Let's pay them as little as possible. Let's give them as little as possible. We don't have to clothe them and feed them. Give them as little as possible, and that's essentially where we are today. You know, you see the cost of living over the last 30, 40 years has blown up and wages haven't kept up. And that's a product of that system. And, you know, this isn't to just say all of capitalism is bad. There has to be a balance, right?
right.
Because right now, our capitalist system is outright abuse. They're abusing the system to abuse the people, from paying you as little as possible to making you pay as much as possible in taxes so they don't have to. And, you know, it's not sustainable. It really
No, it's
isn't.
not.
People are getting more angry. People are calling out billionaires, and I've come to the point where on social media, I'm just asking every about once a month or so, I'll ask, you know, that billionaires have a choice. We can eat them or tax them, you know, because everybody's like, eat the rich or tax the
Yeah,
rich. And I'm like, well, you know, we'll let them decide. You know, we can eat you or tax you. What would you like to do? And it's funny, but there's some truth there because people are getting angry at this whole situation. They don't like Republicans being in bed with billionaires. They don't like Democrats being in bed with billionaires. Everybody's just tired of the money game. It's just out of control. You know, this whole manufactured inflation. I know you've talked about it on the show. I know you and I have talked about this. And, you know, when we injected the trillions of dollars during COVID into the economy, corporations are like, there's trillions of dollars out there for us to capture. And sure enough, you had a little bit of inflation and then they added more to it you know, because in these inflation crises, they're seeing record profits, right? We're getting less groceries. We're struggling. I still have to decide every month or so whether I get my prescriptions or I get groceries, you know, at the end of the month. So it's like as the situation gets worse for us, they continue to show record profits. And people are starting to see just on a basic level that things don't add up. And then, when you start asking, like, I know you've had Marlon Weems on the show. You ask him, who has all this knowledge about the stock market and blows me away every time I talk to him. I learn something new. It really opens your eyes to just how broken and corrupt the system is. And, we talk about all this, right? These parasites pocketing money for doing nothing, but we're talking about that before the corruption aspect of it.
Yes,
You know what
yes.
I'm saying? So, like,
Hmm.
there's the corruption aspect of it. Like, you look at Rick Scott, who got away with ripping off Medicare for I don't know how many hundreds of millions of dollars.
Billions
He's
of dollars, man.
and he's a senator. And he's
Yes,
like, I don't know, he's worth hundreds of millions of dollars and he's a senator. And he's one of them who's advocating for invading Venezuela. He's been doing it since Biden was in office, when him and Marco Rubio were trying to convince Biden to give Eric Prince the $100 million he wanted to assassinate Maduro. And I'm like, they're public about it. I'm like, these are violations of international
they're
law.
war
This is
criminals.
war criminals. And I'm like, you guys are sitting here telling the media that we're going to ask the White House for $100 million so we can give it to Eric Prince so he can, assassinate Maduro. And I'm like, y'all are crazy. But that's the world we live in, and it's just abusive in every aspect, from the corruption to these greedy people putting money in their pocket for doing nothing. Recently, speaking of corruption, like the White House awarded a contract to a sand and gravel company to build a third of the border wall. The border wall is steel. What are you giving it to? And it's because this guy apparently donated a ton of money to the Trump campaign, and it's like this corruption is just so obvious. Like, you couldn't give him a gravel contract and tried to be like, oh, no, you gave him a contract for a steel wall, and this guy deals in sand and gravel. This makes no sense to me. It
It's
just blows me away how corrupt these people are.
it's ridiculous. So we got to keep this up to the work. We are coming up on time right now, and
Okay.
what I want to tell you is that I'm thankful that you had some time to give me today, because you're always enlightening, and I want folks to remember to go and visit your site and what you have to offer with decolonizing journalism, which is a great rag. You speak about everything. You're very enlightened. And again, I learned a lot from you as well. So, I mean, first of all, I want to thank you for doing all the work that you do. I
Man,
also,
I appreciate it.
you have to be called something else, man. You write under, what's the name that you used to use? Madre mia,
The,
dolor.
the
What is it?
antagonist mag,
Yeah.
antagonist. Yeah, I still do the antagonist mag, and basically, like, decolonized journalism is just like the newsletter for that, ad free stuff. But
Right.
I'm on Substack mostly, Substack Notes, as far as that's my preferred social media platform. Um, you know, I'm all over the place under the same username at Extreme Arturo, and right now I'm doing a holiday sale, $35 a year for life, forever.
Mm-hmm.
Just trying to, raise funds, to end the year on a high note, and just kind of, keep on plugging away. There's a lot of work to do. Um, you know, Generally my work is mostly Latino focused, or black focused, like Afro Latino focused. So I bounce back and forth between immigration and policing and Latin America a lot lately. Because there's a need for people to understand these things, and some of, like, the underlying conditions to immigration to this country, and how Latin America's economy affects our economy, things like that. So, yeah, I mean, this has been a fun ride, and, meeting a lot of great people, and, always cool to hang out with you, man. I appreciate everything you do too.
Well, we are in this together. All of us that are doing, we are
Absolutely.
the new media, folks, and what we try to do is we try to bring the alternative to the mainstream media. A lot of these things happen because people just don't know Arturo. And
Right.
one of the things many of us have decided to do is to dedicate our lives to going forward, to inform, to research, to look out, and try to get people thinking not the way they were programmed to think, but the way things really are. So
Yeah.
again, I always end it with these pitch and saying, please support independent journalism. Arturo, Extreme Arturo, please support Arturo. Please support Egberto off the record. That's the two of us that are here. Do the best you can to make sure that we can continue doing what we do here to inform. And now I like to end on a positive note. I see, as Arturo mentioned earlier, when he said people are getting angry, that's true. That's half the job. It's what do you do with that anger? And what we are trying to promote here is to give people avenues as far as how to use that anger to make things better for all of us. And there are a lot of us starting to do this work now. And that's why we ask you, please support this work because it is worth doing it. Arturo, as usual, thank you so kindly for spending this time with me. And to the audience out there, thank you so kindly for listening to us. Remember, as you get these things, go ahead and share them out and make sure people understand what's going on. Together we can make that change. Arturo, muchísimas gracias por todo y tenga súper bien fin de
Igualmente.
semana.
Igualmente, brother. Thanks,
Ciao.
man.